You've got the LLC. You've got that business side of things handled. Maybe you even used a business attorney or your accountant or someone to help you get things set up. And the thing is, you might still be exposed in places neither you nor they have been watching. So here's what that looks like. A business coach, I'm going to call her Elena. She got a call from one of her podcast guests, furious. The marketing team had pulled a clip from their conversation recorded 18 months earlier, and they turned it into a paid ad creative for her signature program. Now, the guest had never actually agreed to that. So Elena had done some things right. 6 years running her coaching business, started the LLC on day one, contracts reviewed by her attorney. When she called him about the clip, his answer was simple. That's not really something I handle. He wasn't wrong. He had built her business side, but nobody ever built out the media side. And that's an important gap. The moment you record, publish, and distribute content, you're operating in a second industry, the media business, with its own assets, its own rules, its own exposure. Whether that content is the business itself or just the marketing for the business. So that's what today's episode is all about. I'm Gordon Firemark, the podcast lawyer, and this is Legit Podcast Pro, a show that helps podcasters to build businesses that are worth building, not just content worth watching. If you're a coach, a course creator, a consultant, or you run any kind of service business, and your podcast is the thing that brings people in the door, well, this episode is for you. Now, I want to be clear about something up front. This isn't about whether you're running a real business. If you've got an LLC, if you've got client contracts, if you've got a business attorney you trust, you've already got that handled. This episode isn't questioning any of that. What I want to talk about is something most podcasters in your position, businesses who have a podcast, never really think to ask. When you started producing the podcast, you didn't just add a marketing channel. What you did is added a second category of business activity to your business: recording, publish, and distributing content. And that category comes with its own legal terrain. Not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the legal relationship most service business owners have was built around their original business. It usually wasn't designed with a media operation in mind because there wasn't one yet. And those lawyers, those accountants, they aren't trained to think about entertainment and media law issues the way some of us are. So what I want to do today is walk you through 4 things that podcasters in this kind of situation consistently overlook. And it's not because they're careless. It's because nobody's ever pointed a flashlight at this particular corner of the business. And let me just say this now, because it's relevant to all 4 of these. For creators whose show has become a real driver of their business and not just an experiment, this is often the moment worth a conversation with someone who handles both the business side and the media side. Not to replace anyone you're already working with if you're happy with them. Just make sure that the part of your business that didn't exist when you set everything up actually has someone looking after it, watching for trouble. So let's get into this. The first blind spot is that your podcast itself is itself intellectual property, not just marketing collateral for the business that it's promoting. And this shows up in a couple of different ways. First, ownership of the content itself. If you work with an editor, a producer, an agency, and there's no written agreement transferring rights in the finished episodes to you, well, ownership can be murkier than you might assume. I've talked with lots of folks who've used the same freelance editor for years on a simple handshake understanding, only to discover this gap when they want to repurpose some of those old episodes into something like a paid course or in a licensing deal. And they realize nobody ever spelled out in writing that the finished product actually belongs to them. It's not enough just to assume, well, I paid them, so I own it, right? Because that's not the way the law works. Now, the second way your podcast is intellectual property that needs to be considered, and it's one that people almost never think about, is the show's brand, the title of the show, the tagline, the segment titles if you have segments. Because sometimes recurring segment names like these things are your brand assets. Same way your business name and logo are brand assets. And most never bother to register any kind of protection for them at all. This is one of the most common calls that I get as a podcast lawyer. Creator discovers another show has started using the same name or something really close that's likely enough to cause some confusion. Couple of years in, hundreds of episodes, you've got a real audience recognizing the name, waiting for the next episode, and no trademark registration you can point to. So that means very little actual leverage to do anything about it. You protected the business name from day one. The show's name, built up by episode, month after month, often never gets that same level of treatment. And it's not just about the name. If you have those recurring segments that become a part of your identity, something that listeners associate specifically with you, like, I don't know, the Crazy Corner or something like that, well, that's worth the same kind of thinking. You don't necessarily need to register everything from day one, but you do need to know which of your podcast's assets are actually worth protecting and make a deliberate choice about it rather than assuming your business trademark somehow covers a show name that's never been registered separately. And if your business isn't the media business, then it's a different class of goods and services, so the registration needs to be expanded to cover everything. Now, the second blind spot that we see a lot is guest and participant consent. This is exactly what happened to that example, Elena, I was talking about. The standard release usually covers permission to record and publish the episode. The implied release covers that. But what it often doesn't cover is permission to pull a clip from that episode 2 years later and use it as paid advertising for a different purpose. Those are two completely different uses, and reasonable people might expect two different levels of consent involved. Elena's guest had agreed to be on the podcast, but hadn't agreed to appear in an ad campaign. And that distinction is exactly the kind of thing that a media-focused release really accounts for. And general business contracts typically don't, because it was never written with that specific use in mind. Now, this matters even more the more valuable your content becomes. An episode that quietly sits in your back catalog carries very little risk. But an episode that turns out to be your best performing bit of content, that one that's worth repurposing into ads and promos and things, a course module or into a highlight reel for your next launch, that's exactly the episode where this consent question really becomes a thing. The releases most podcasters use, if they use one at all, were often written for narrower situations. Use mine. Go to podcastrelease.com and it covers you. This is one where the content can actually where it can allow you to use that content, reuse it in other media without any problems. Now, the third blind spot is that your team and your production agreements need to look different from the agreements you use with your clients and customers. If you've got an editor, for example, or a producer, a writer, a virtual assistant who comes in contact with your podcast content, whether that's making clips, raw footage, guest information, whatever, that person is handling important copyrighted material and sometimes sensitive information about the people who are appearing on your show. They are not your clients. Your client-facing contracts are built to protect client relationships and really weren't designed to address what happens when a production team member has access to that unreleased footage or decides to leave and work with a competitor. Unfortunately, I've seen this play out with a podcaster who had a virtual assistant who also handled social media clips, and someone with regular access to raw, unreleased episodes. When she took a job with a competing business, nothing in her agreement said she couldn't take some of that footage with her. Not to mention the knowledge, right? Not because she was dishonest by nature, but because nobody had ever written down what she could and couldn't do. This is usually a pretty easy fix. And that's part of why it's frustrating when it gets missed. A short confidentiality and intellectual property assignment provision added to whatever agreement you're already using with those contractors will close most of the gap. It's not a complex issue. It's just that most creators aren't using that. They are using a general template for an independent contractor, same one they'd use to hire a bookkeeper or something. But this person is actually handling media assets and maybe creating assets, and the template was never built with that person in mind. Again, if you head on over to Podcast Law Forums and grab our independent contractor agreement, you'll be covered. Now, we're only scratching the surface of the team-related risk here. Building out a production team requires all kinds of things, and it raises questions well beyond who owns it. And that's worth its own dedicated conversation down the road, so keep an eye out for that. But the fourth blind spot I want to talk about is insurance, specifically that general business liability insurance coverage probably won't extend to media-specific risk. Errors and omissions insurance coverage built around your coaching or consulting services typically protects against claims related to the advice or the services you provide. But it's not generally built to cover things like defamation claims or right of publicity or privacy issues or intellectual property disputes tied to the content you publish. Those are the kinds of claims that come specifically from operating as a media publisher. If your podcast has real reach, this is worth a direct conversation with whoever handles your business insurance, specifically about what your current policy does and doesn't cover on the media side. So picture a podcaster here, purely hypothetical now, but a completely plausible one. The episode about a competitor's business practices gets picked up and shared widely, and that competitor then threatens to sue for defamation. The podcaster calls up their insurance broker thinking they've got it covered, only to learn that their policy was written for a consulting practice. It never thought about published commentary about a named business. That's not a hypothetical because it's rare. It's a hypothetical because most podcasters in this situation, they never find out one way or the other until they're already asking the question under pressure. And often they have to settle quickly to avoid an expensive lawsuit because the insurance ain't there to cover it. So notice what these 4 blind spots all have in common: content ownership, brand protection, guest consent, team agreements, and insurance. None of that is about whether your coaching or consulting practice is legit. Every single one of them is about the podcast and its as its own business, as its own asset, and sitting inside its own industry, largely unattended because it grew up alongside a business that already felt fully covered. So here's what actually changes as your show grows into a real part of your business. The stakes on all 4 of these go way up. A podcast with 100 downloads an episode may not carry a lot of exposure, but if it's actively driving leads and generating sponsorship revenue, feeding a signature program, that is a meaningful business asset. And meaningful business assets are exactly the kind of thing that worth deliberately protecting, not by accident. And here's the honest version of what happens if you don't. It's rarely a lawsuit that comes out of nowhere. Usually it's a guest relationship that's strained because they feel used the way Elena's guest did. Or guests, talk to other potential guests, so the damage doesn't always stay contained in one relationship. It's about a contractor dispute over who actually owns several years' worth of episodes. And you discover it at the exact moment that you're trying to license or sell some of that content. It's about finding out that someone else has been building on your show's name for months before you even noticed. And at that point, stopping them is much harder and more expensive than it would have been at the start of things. Or it's about discovering that your insurance has a gap in coverage only after something's already gone wrong. And without exception, that is the worst possible time to find that out. Now, none of these are giant dramatic things. That's actually the point. They are quiet, slow-building problems that don't announce themselves the way a lawsuit does. That's exactly why they're so easy to overlook till the moment that they're not. Now, some of this you can absolutely start on your own. A clear, written guest release that covers the actual uses you intend for your content, not just publishing the episode, but repurposing it. That's something that you can put in place quickly. Just head on over to podcastrelease.com and grab the freebie. Basic IP assignment language in your contractor agreements, same kind of thing. Very reasonable starting points, and getting it down in writing really beats a handshake every single time. Where it's worth bringing someone in, like a lawyer, is a trademark clearance and registration issue, which requires an actual search and a real filing. This is not guesswork. It's where genuine insurance review, where someone looks at your actual policy language against what your podcast is actually doing, that becomes important. And frankly, it's often just the broader question. Does the legal structure and relationship I set up years ago, before I added the media operation, still match what my business has actually become and what it needs? I personally work with podcasters in this spot all the time. Someone whose original business is well lawyered up and whose podcast has just sort of outgrown the scope of whatever that original relationship was, and nobody notices it happening. It's not usually one dramatic gap. It's usually 5 small little things, each one sort of easy to explain away on its own. But together, they add up to a business that's operating with a big blind spot, something nobody assigned anyone to watch and nobody knew how to take care of. So that's really the question underneath this whole episode. Not, am I a real business? You already know you are. It's, does my current legal setup actually cover everything that I'm running now? For a lot of podcasters in your position, the honest answer is that it covers about the half that it was built for, and it hasn't caught up to the half that grew up alongside it. So I'm going to leave you with this. You didn't do anything wrong by treating your podcast as just marketing for your show. That's the way it is for a lot of businesses. But somewhere along the way, without anyone announcing it, it became something else too: a body of content, a brand, a set of relationships with guests and contributors, all of it worth real protection. Not instead of the business you built it to promote, but right there alongside it. So I'm Gordon Firemark, and this has been Legit Podcast Pro. I'll see you again next week for another important discussion. Thanks.